Thank you, Theo. Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure this evening to be introducing Dr. Ima Ramos. Dr. Ramos did a PhD at Cambridge and then became the curator of medieval to modern South Asia collections at the British Museum. And I think it's over a year ago, time has sort of kaleidoscope, but she curated the wonderful Tantra Enlightenment to Revolution exhibition, which was obviously sort of slightly had a few hitches thanks to the pandemic, but it ran between September 2020 and January 2021. And she was the author of this wonderful catalogue book. I'm not actually at home, so I don't have the book with me, but this amazing catalogue, which I highly recommend. Hopefully we'll see a few images from it this evening. A few revelations from the show that I had no idea about, in particular that the Rolling Stones logo of the mouth and the lips and tongue was inspired by the goddess Kali. That was a new one on me. So yeah, highly recommend that book. And so the exhibition in the book presents the first historical exploration of tantric visual culture from its origins in India to its reimagining in the West. And Dr. Ramos's research interests, revolve around the relationship between religion, politics, and gender in South Asian visual culture. And this evening, Dr. Ramos is going to talk to us about the show and an aspect of the show. So the title is Tantra, Enlightenment to Revolution, an exhibition at the British Museum. So over to you, Ima. Thank you very much for agreeing to give us a talk.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thanks, Theo. Thanks for inviting me to speak about the exhibition. I'm just going to share my screen with you all. And hopefully you can see that. I'm just going to... So, yeah, I'd like to start by introducing everyone to the overall ambitions of the exhibition, which ran between September 2020 and January 2021. And the show essentially aimed to demystify Tantra and challenge that Western stereotype that we're all familiar with, that it's a hedonistic guide to sex. The first major exhibition of tantric material culture in the West was held in 1971 at the Hayward Gallery in London. A cult of ecstasy, reflecting a particular reading of Tantra as a so-called cult that could overcome stifled attitudes to sexuality. And this was very much a product of Tantra's reception in the West during the 70s, but of course the idea still persists today. The show at the British Museum presented Tantra as an Indian philosophy which affirms all aspects of the material world as sacred and infused with divine feminine power. Visitors learnt that Tantra teaches that enlightenment can be achieved rapidly by actively engaging with spiritual obstacles, such as desire, aversion, and fear, in order to ultimately transcend them. Tantric imagery is therefore unique in its inclusion of erotic and macabre symbolism. The central aim of the show and the accompanying catalogue was to present a history of tantric visual culture, from its origins in early medieval India to how it was then reimagined in the West. Tantra is rooted in sacred instructional texts, composed from around the 6th century onwards, which are often written in the form of a dialogue between a god and a goddess. We open the exhibition with some of the earliest surviving tantras in the world, on loan from Cambridge University Library. The exhibition was then divided into 4 major sections, which explored Tantra's links to successive waves of revolutionary thought, from its early medieval transformation of Hinduism and Buddhism to the Indian fight for independence and the rise of 1960s counterculture. The show presented an examination of Tantra through a series of visual case studies, some of which I'll be talking to you about today, almost all from the museum's collection, to illustrate a history of Tantra beyond the texts. The Tantras can be enormously enriched by an understanding of the material objects to which they gave rise. The range of objects in the exhibition included representations of tantric deities and tantric practitioners, objects used in tantric practice, and objects that reflect reinterpretations as well as misunderstandings of Tantra. Above all, the aim was to provide visitors with the tools for recognizing certain signs and signifiers, from skull cups and weapons to sexual acts, as specifically relating to the tantric imaginary, in order to understand how its philosophy has been visualized throughout history. Each of these signs carries a range of different associations and meanings depending on the object's original intended audience, from rulers and lay devotees to monks and yogis, as well as its context, whether public or private. The first major section of the exhibition explored the rise of Tantra in medieval India. The development of Tantra in India coincided with the rise of many new kingdoms across the subcontinent after the decline of the Gupta and Vakataka dynasties. Although this led to political precariousness, there was also a great flourishing of the arts. Many rulers were to Tantra's promise of power as guardians. The tantric god Bhairav, seen here, he is the tantric manifestation of the Hindu god Shiva, who delights in defying social and religious boundaries. According to myth, Bhairav beheaded the orthodox god Brahma, who had insulted Shiva. Bhairav wandered across cremation grounds as penance, using Brahma's skull as an alms bowl. The story reveals the tensions between orthodox and tantric Hindu traditions, the display of Bhairav's strength, symbolizing the superior powers of the tantric path. And here he clutches Brahma's severed head, and in his other hands he holds a trident, a sword, and a two-headed drum, which Shiva uses to drum the universe into creation and dissolution. Early tantric practitioners imitated Bhairav's appearance and behavior by carrying their own skull cups and dwelling in cremation grounds in order to emulate him and overcome obstacles to enlightenment, such as disgust, fear, and attachment. Rulers worshipped him in order to strengthen their political positions, drawing on his immense power. And so here you can see he appears naked, a wild shock of hair streaming out of his head like fire. His arched eyebrows and bulbous eyes and fangs reveal a controlled fury. And he's accompanied by a dog, one that feeds on decaying flesh. And this stone carving was made for a temple commissioned by a member of the Chola court in southern India. And it shows how fierce tantric deities were brought into the public and popular arena of temple worship during the medieval period. The rise of Tantra within Buddhism occurred in response to its rise within Hinduism, creatively adapting by incorporating tantric deities and altering them to suit Buddhist goals. These are two tantric Buddhist gods who have incorporated many of Bhairav's attributes, and it reveals that fluidity between Hinduism and Buddhism, but it also shows competition as well. So the bronze figure on the right looks like Bhairav, but he's also actually trampling the Hindu god Bhairav under his foot. This part of the exhibition also explored Tantra's radical challenge to gender norms. Tantra presented a new worldview which saw all material reality as animated by Shakti, divine feminine power. This worldview inspired the dramatic rise of goddess worship in medieval India. Tantric goddesses challenged traditional models of womanhood as passive and docile in their intertwining of destructive and maternal power. The earliest known text to describe the idea of Shakti is the Devi Mahatmya, or Glory of the Goddess, composed between around 400 and 600 AD. This is a folio from a 17th century edition. And it tells the story of the goddess Durga, who defeats a series of demons embodying ignorance, who the gods had been unable to defeat. Durga's death blow became a popular subject in medieval temple sculpture. Here, an 8th century sculpture represents Durga as a weapon-wielding, lion-riding warrior who has defeated the buffalo demon Mahisha, who threatened the stability of the universe. She was adopted by many rulers as their guardian and regarded as a source of their strength. In the Devi Mahatmya, a group of tantric goddesses called the matrikas, or mothers, helped Durga to defeat the demons. Their martial abilities were harnessed by rulers to ensure victories on their own battlefields. Here we see Chamunda, the leader of the mothers. She's skeletal to signal her constant hunger, which she satisfies by consuming demonic forces. She carries a sword of wisdom with which she destroys not only demons, but also obstacles to enlightenment. She dances on a corpse, which embodies the fragile human ego that must be overcome. Although she appears fierce, she also conveys compassion and a desire to assist her followers on their spiritual path by releasing them from ignorance. In the exhibition, her symbolism was decoded. This was an interpretive strand that ran throughout the exhibition. In each section, we highlighted an object that demanded extra unpacking, and we decoded its symbolism using specially designed graphics. And this also helped us with the challenges of the exhibition's word limit. So each object's label could only be around 80 words max. Sometimes, if we were lucky, 120 words if it was a double label. So this was quite challenging. And we worked closely with an interpretation officer to ensure the language and the tone was as accessible as possible. But luckily, of course, the catalogue presented that opportunity to expand further on the subject and go into greater depth beyond the parameters of the exhibition. At the heart of the exhibition was the museum's 10th century temple statue of a Yogini from Kanchi, alongside an imaginative and immersive recreation of one of the most famous Yogini temples in India. And this is an element of the show that I am going to explore in a bit more detail now, before ending with a summary of how the story of the Yoginis was placed in context with the rest of the exhibition narrative. The accompanying label for this Yogini sculpture pointed out her fangs and her earrings, which are made of a dismembered hand and a cobra, as well as her cobra armlets and the skull-top staff and skull cup that she holds. It also noted that between the 10th and the 14th centuries, royal patrons commissioned Yogini temples across India, and that rulers believed that Yoginis could predict the future, protect their kingdoms against disease or enemy armies, and help them win new territories. The Yogini statue introduced a space evoking the famous Yogini temple in Hirapur in Odisha, which was built around the 10th century. We have an archive of photographs of this temple taken in the 1990s by our in-house museum photographer, John Williams, which we were able to draw on for this project. It's a really fantastic photograph, a really detailed photographic archive of the temple. And we wanted to transport visitors to a time when devotion to the Yoginis was at its height. Most Yogini temples were circular and unique in their roofless design, perhaps, as Gordon White suggests, in order to attract the Yoginis from the sky into the sacred courtyard. Due to space and design limitations, we could only show 12 of the 64 Yoginis, unfortunately, which encircle the temple's interior walls here. And some of them you can see standing and dancing upon animals that they can shapeshift into. Others balance upon corpses and dismembered heads, and some of the Yoginis here drink from skull cups. So I'm now going to discuss the development of this audiovisual section, which took inspiration from Sanskrit texts composed between the 7th and 13th centuries that evoke reverential attitudes towards yoginis, as well as some of the tantric rituals that may have been carried out within yogini temples. For this, I also, of course, drew on the research and translations of Shaman Hatley, Vidya Dahegia, Gordon White, and Padma Kaimal. Tantric texts state that the ideal time to invoke yoginis is at night, when initiated and experienced practitioners should make impure offerings of blood, alcohol, flesh, or sexual fluids to nourish them. In return, yoginis are said to grant access to their powers, from flight and immortality to control over others. The temple would have also invited devotional worship from visitors during the day, including offerings of flowers. So we wanted to play with that idea of private and public forms of devotion by evoking the temple in nocturnal and daytime settings. As the temple was open to the skies, we wanted to create a sense of the night sky and the sounds of night and the change of light from dusk through night to dawn and day. In our focus groups conducted during the early development stages of the show, visitors really liked the idea of immersive techniques to give a sense of time and place. And since the yoginis are central to an understanding of Tantra and its relationship with divine feminine power, and they have a special place within Tantric practice, we wanted them to be a focus in the exhibition. There are references to yoginis throughout the show in Pan-Asian, Hindu and Buddhist contexts. The aim with the audio-visual installation was to emphasize their qualities and a sense of their impact through an evocation of a temple dedicated to them. Since many of the sculptures in the first part of the show originated from medieval Indian temples, we also wanted to evoke a sacred monumental space that was simultaneously unique in its architectural design and closely associated with tantric deities and practice. The space in the show drew imagery and inspiration from the Hirapur temple without attempting to replicate it exactly. We worked with a company called Center Screen to achieve this using a mix of graphics and lighting and textile and projection. Center Screen specialize in producing audio-visual media and installations from immersive environments to large-scale interactive spaces. And in a moment, I'm going to play you a 3-minute film. Well, it's the 3-minute film that visitors would have experienced when they walked into the space. So you'll have to try and imagine it as a sort of 360-degree experience. And as you watch the film, you'll notice it becomes more creative and evocative during the nocturnal scene in particular. So since yoginis could fly and also shapeshift into women and birds, snakes, tigers and jackals as the mood took them, we wanted to subtly suggest the flight and the shape-shifting powers of the yoginis using different aesthetic effects. For example, the flight of birds and bats. The challenge, of course, was to do this without it feeling orientalist or exoticizing. It was important to keep this creative part of the film really simple and to ground it in the words of Sanskrit texts describing the yoginis. We also decided to hone in on details of the yogini sculptures themselves, including their attributes, such as cobras and skull cups, and amplify them as another way of grounding the creative approach and highlighting the primary source material. Center Screen played with size and visual effects to alternate between solidity and dynamic movement to again suggest the yogini's shape-shifting qualities. Different yoginis were highlighted at certain points, and the suggestion of firelight and smoke were designed to evoke the sense that someone was holding up a lamp to the sculptures in the tradition of Arti, in which light from a flame is offered to a deity. What bound the film together were the quotes from Sanskrit texts translated into English, which were read by two voice actors, Amina Zia and Sid Sagar. This included the Brahmayamala Tantra, which is one of the earliest goddess-centered tantras dating back to the late 7th or early 8th century. And the passage describes how to successfully summon the yoginis in order to hear their prophecies and warns of the potential hazards. Another passage came from the 11th century Katha Saritsagara by Somadeva, which features a tale about a queen accessing the yogini's limitless power. In one chapter, she narrates how she succeeded in joining their skybound ranks. Two other quotes came from the Kularnava Tantra, composed between the 11th and 15th centuries, which invoke the yoginis in a supplicatory tone. And finally, there was a descriptive passage from Somadeva Suri's historical romance, Yashastilaka, composed in the 10th century, which provides vivid descriptive passages of the yoginis. And at different points, our very own Jim Mallinson could be heard reciting the passage from the Brahmayamala Tantra in the original Sanskrit, which was fantastic, so you'll hear him. And we wanted to include the Devanagari script as part of the captioning for this. Apart from the voices of the actors reciting Sanskrit text, there were other atmospheric sounds that could be heard that we wanted to incorporate. We wanted to include the sounds of night and day and the distant sounds of the animals that yoginis were said to metamorphose into, particularly animals that the yoginis are shown standing on top of at Hirapur, such as parrots, peacocks, crows, frogs, cobras, and jackals. And there was a sound of a damaru, or double-headed drum, towards the end, because some of the yoginis are shown carrying one. So with that, I'm hoping what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop share, and then Theo is actually going to play you the film. Oh gosh, sorry, hang on one second. Stop share.
Japen mantro mahasattvo vigvaso dakshina mukha saptaratrena yoginyo agachanti mahabhaya raudrupas tatha shudha sakrodha maranatmika tadrushva tu nabhetavyam virasatvena mantra.
To those eternal yoginis, by whose glory the three worlds have been established, to them I bow down, to them I pray. Whether fierce or gentle, terrible to behold, all-powerful, residing in the sky, on earth or in the vastness of space, may those yoginis always be well disposed towards me.
I suddenly saw that my friends, the yoginis, having flown upward, were roaming about in the field of the sky, each by means of her own supernatural power. I called in amazement and made them descend from the sky. The practitioner of Great Spirit should recite the mantra naked, facing south.
After 7 nights, the yoginis come.
Highly dangerous, with terrifying forms, impure, angry, and lethal.
The ornamental designs on their cheeks were painted with blood, which was being lapped up by the many snakes adorning their ears.
sparks rising from the third eye on their foreheads were fanned into flames by the gaspings of the helpless serpents, ruthlessly enmeshed in the tangled masses of their hair.
They tell truly the future, good and bad.
Ushyante natra sandeha sadhake sattva sanyukte katayanti cha tam sprishtva yatharthan cha shubha shubham.
If by mistake a practitioner of weak spirit should tremble, the yoginis, arrogant with their yoga, devour him that very moment.
That's great, thanks Theo. I'm just going to share again, if I can. Okay. Yeah, so hopefully that will have given you a bit of a sense of the audio-visual experience that we try to achieve in that part of the exhibition. And in our evaluation findings, that this sort of immersive part of the show was a standout feature for a lot of visitors. They felt it gave a sense of time and place, and I learned a lot about the importance of use of digital with scholarship at its heart through the experience of working on this temple evocation. And I think that new technologies really have to be mastered and used by museums to bring research and interpretation to wider audiences and encourage greater engagement. And there are references to yoginis in the later parts of the show. I shouldn't say there were, now that the show's over, in Pan-Asian, Hindu and Buddhist contexts, and I'll just briefly talk you through some examples of those. So just as the yogini goddesses were central to the Hindu Vidyapita Tantras from around the 8th century onwards, the equivalent tantric Buddhist Dakini goddesses, also often referred to as yoginis, were integral to the Buddhist yogini tantras, written between around the 8th and the 10th centuries. By the 8th century, the tantras were being studied in Hindu and Buddhist monasteries across India, reflecting the fluid exchanges between Hindu-Buddhist traditions. Dakinis, like yoginis in tantric Hinduism, are skybound goddesses to be feared as well as venerated. This is a yantra or ritual diagram, at the top of which is a dakini within an upside down triangle, a symbol of the yoni or vulva, and creative power. This featured in a section of the show exploring the spread of Tantra across Asia via pilgrimage networks, with a particular focus on Tibet. Vajrayogini, the goddess shown here, is both a ferocious Dakini and a meditational deity. In this lunging form, red and blazing, she's said to have appeared to the Mahasiddha Naropa in a vision, giving her the name Naro Dakini. Japan's dominant belief system was Shinto, based on the worship of nature deities known as kami. In the early 9th century, a Japanese monk called Kukai brought tantric Buddhist teachings from China to Japan and established the Shingon or mantra tradition. The Shinto kami Inari emerged with the tantric figure of a Dakini and became Dakini 10, which means Dakini deity. She's often shown riding a fox, here carried aloft by dragons. She holds a sword with a Vajra handle and flaming, wish-fulfilling jewels. As Inari was a kami of the rice harvest, Dakiniten became associated with fertility and also with worldly success and power. She was often called upon in imperial ceremonies to promote the legitimacy of Japan's emperors. Like the wild, shape-shifting Dakinis and Yoginis of Tibet and India, Dakini-ten was also believed to be capable of causing ruin if dissatisfied, leading to her regular ritual appeasement. We also included representations of mortal yoginis, or figures that blur the line between mortal and divine. Many tantric texts insist that men should venerate women and never offend them because they could be yoginis in disguise. Indeed, the word yogini often simply refers to female practitioner of tantra or yoga. One of the recurring themes of the exhibition explored how tantra's emphasis on feminine power not only informed the rise of goddess worship in India, but also how this in turn affected the status of women. Earlier Hindu and Buddhist traditions taught that the female body was an impediment to achieving enlightenment, and that women should remain submissive and dependent on men. Tantra, on the other hand, taught that women could achieve rapid enlightenment because they were natural embodiments of Shakti. Many tantric texts even say that for this reason, women should be venerated as goddesses in their own right. The ultimate aim of tantric practice is to become a deity, to fully internalize their power. Tantric images re-envisioned women as independent practitioners who were capable of achieving self-deification. We see this through the historical figure of Karaikal Amaya, who lived in Tamil Nadu in South India in the 6th century. According to popular accounts of her life, she was a very beautiful, very dutiful wife, but she was harboring a desire to pursue her own radical spiritual quest. She eventually abandoned her role as an obedient wife to become a follower of the god Shiva. She asked Shiva to replace her beauty with a fearsome appearance, which echoed that of Chamunda, or a ferocious yogini. Here you can see that she's assumed that fierce appearance. She's skeletal and she has bulbous eyes and fangs. This is a modern representation of her that we have in the collection. For the exhibition, we included a medieval sculpture of her from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. She's shown reciting one of her visionary poems here, accompanying herself with a pair of cymbals. In one of her poems, she describes her time spent meditating in a cremation ground, where she confronts and conquers her own ego and fear of mortality. And this is a quote from one of her poems. In the cremation ground where you hear crackling noises and the white pearls fall out of the tall bamboo, the ghouls with frizzy hair and drooping bodies, shouting with wide open mouths, come together and feast on the corpses. In rejecting her social role and assuming a transgressive tantric one, she achieved an enlightened state. Today she's regarded as both a devotional and tantric icon and is venerated as a saint across Tamil Nadu. Women played important roles not only as independent masters, but also as tantric gurus or teachers who initiated disciples and shared otherwise secret teachings with them, including rituals for achieving union with a deity and access to a range of powers. This painting from around 1750 shows a noble woman who's travelled a great distance to visit two female tantric masters who are seated on the left. She appears to be seeking counsel or initiation from the elder woman, whose age is expressively suggested with really sensitive attention to detail. Many tantric texts describe women as superior teachers in their embodiment of Shakti. One example says that there are no rules for women, all are said to be gurus. The two female tantric masters here on the left have long dreadlocks. One is wearing them piled on top of her head, and they're both wearing small horns around their necks, which identifies them as members of the Nat order, a tantric community founded around the 12th century. The Nat order famously popularized tantric yoga, which involved awakening an individual source of Shakti at the base of the spine through breath control. This awakening was believed to trigger instant enlightenment and offer a range of other powers from long life to invulnerability. Rulers across India were attracted to tantric masters as agents of power who could strengthen and lend authority to their political positions. This included the Mughal dynasty, who arrived from Central Asia in the 16th century. They commissioned some of the earliest detailed representations of women as yoginis, such as this one. This Tibetan painting from the Rubin Museum represents the renowned female tantric yogini Machi Glabdran, who lived in Tibet in the 11th century. She introduced new tantric practices designed to overcome the fear of death and attachment to self, and initiated hundreds of disciples. She's most famous for popularizing the practice known as chirp, meaning to cut, which involved the use of human remains used as instruments, like the ones shown here. It entailed the visualization of the dissection of one's own body, and by extension the ego, which is presented as an offering to divine spirits. She advised carrying out chirp at night in a frightening place, such as a charnel ground, in order to directly confront the limitations of one's fear, and to a trumpet made from human thigh bone invite the spirits to devour the body during this ritual. The final parts of the exhibition looked at the reception of Tantra from the 19th century onwards. Firstly, how Tantra was harnessed for its insurgent potential during the fight for Indian independence in the late 19th century, and then how Tantra has been reimagined from the 20th century until today. Take the tantric goddess Kali, for example. This figure dates to the late 19th century and was made in Bengal, which was an early centre of Tantra, as well as the nucleus of British rule at the time. A garland of severed heads hangs around her neck, corpses from her ears and hands from her girdle. Her mouth is smeared with blood, and she sticks out her tongue as though thirsting for more. On the surface she appears fierce, but she's approached as a mother figure. The heads represent the ego, which Kali helps her devotees to transcend. She's shown standing on her husband, the god Shiva. According to tantric belief, existence results from the erotic union between Shakti as creative force, embodied here by Kali, and Shiva as pure consciousness. The image of Kali striding over Shiva symbolizes the superiority of the female principle within Tantra. Kali was completely misunderstood by Christian missionaries and colonial officials, who saw her as demonic and reflective of India's apparent sexual depravity. Indian revolutionaries in Bengal harnessed Kali's radical potential, playing on that British anxiety and paranoia. They reimagined her and other tantric goddesses as figureheads of resistance and symbols of an independent India rising up against the British. Aside from Kali, one of the most powerful icons employed by revolutionaries was the tantric goddess Chinnamasta, who is revered in both Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Her name literally translates as "she whose head is severed." Images of this goddess mainly date from around the 18th century onwards. We see a proliferation of her image in late 19th century Bengal in particular. In this hand-coloured print made in the colonial capital of Calcutta, Chinnamasta clutches her own severed head, which animatedly drinks one of the 3 streams of blood spurting from her neck. The other 2 streams nourish her attendants, who offer Chinnamasta the heads of 2 sacrificial victims. The iconography of the woodblock print communicates that inseparability and interdependence of sex, life, and death. Chinnamasta stands upon the copulating deities of love and desire, Kama and Rati. Rati is shown on top of Kama, which reflects an instruction of a 16th century tantric text called the Tantrasara to meditate on the deities in Viparita Rata, or the reverse sexual position, elevating Rati's authority and suggesting a deliberate inversion of hierarchical order. Rati's dominant stance not only signals the superiority of the female principle within Tantra, but also emphasizes the transgressive nature of this reversal. The fact that Chinnamasta stands on the couple suggests that she both subjugates sexual desire and is fundamentally supported and energized by its power. During the 19th century, this aspect of the image would have resonated with Bengali terrorists who had taken a vow of celibacy and would have understood Chinnamasta's pose as expressing the transcendence of worldly lust. The belief that one should remain celibate until the motherland achieved independence from the British was popular during the colonial period and was considered a form of sacrifice. The retention of semen was also regarded as a source of strength. The British diplomat Ignatius Valentine Churel commented on the circulation of Chinnamasta's printed image in his 1910 book Indian Unrest. And this is a quote by him. He says, "She's represented holding in her hand her head, which has been severed from her body, while the blood gushing from her trunk flows into her mouth. A very popular picture of the goddess in this form has been published with a text to the effect that the great goddess as seen therein symbolizes the motherland, decapitated by the English, but nevertheless preserving her vitality unimpaired by drinking her own blood." Among Bengali revolutionaries, the image of Chinnamasta decapitating herself represented an ideal of heroic fearlessness and self-sacrifice. Appropriately, the Tantrasara describes her invocation in rituals designed to control, combat, and conquer enemies. This section of the show on the harnessing of Tantra by Indian revolutionaries was one of the most popular sections of the exhibition amongst visitors, according to our audience evaluation, and showed a real public appetite for engaging in colonial critique. For example, one visitor said, quote, "I appreciated the framing and honesty around Britain's role in suppressing and demonizing Tantra, owning and acknowledging British history." So for me, this was about the need to emphasize alternative perspectives on empire by foregrounding the voices and the agency of those under colonial rule. And as curators, we really need to develop new ways of interpreting objects that foreground multivocal experiences and challenge preconceptions of the past. Artists in Asia and the West from the 20th century until today have been inspired by Tantra, interpreting it as a radical movement capable of challenging repressive attitudes towards gender, sex, and politics. Contemporary female artists have been inspired by tantric iconography and have also playfully subverted it. Although many, if not most, tantric traditions emphasize the role of women and goddesses, their traditional representations have sometimes been described as male constructions of femaleness. Certainly, their often ambivalent characteristics, veering between overt eroticism and destructive violence, can be read as reflecting a male fear of feminine power. Nevertheless, this same ambivalence, which challenged traditional models of womanhood, has been a source of empowerment for modern women who continue to reclaim their spiritual authority in creative and emancipatory ways. The exhibition ended with two dramatic works of art which harness tantric goddesses through the bodies of real women, evoking them in a feminist guise. And this included this almost 3-meter tall mixed media painting entitled "Housewives with Steak Knives," which challenges the stereotype of the submissive wife confined to the kitchen. It's by the Bengal-born British artist Hirapur Biswas. And so here you can see the housewife as the goddess Kali wears a garland of heads that the artist describes as figureheads of authoritarian patriarchy. Like Biswas, Bharti Kaur, who was born in London and is now based in Delhi, draws on the bodies of women in her creation of dramatic and resonant urban goddesses, as she describes them. Her life-size sculptures are made from casts of the bodies of friends and acquaintances whose naked and muscular and fleshy features are infused with a powerful gravity, blurring the boundaries between mortal and divine. This 2008 sculpture, entitled "And All the While the Benevolent Slept," is an evocation of Chinnamasta. Headless and squatting on a log, you can see here Chinnamasta is holding up what is presumably her own skull, while copper wires shoot out angles from its open neck. The reconstructed skull of Lucy, the oldest million years old. This nod to human origins alludes to Chinnamasta's embodiment of the foundation and cycle of life itself. In another hand, the figure balances a jarringly quaint teacup on a saucer, a witty signifier of bourgeois domesticity, which was transplanted from Britain to India during the colonial period. One wonders at the fate of the original owner of this teacup at the hands of its confrontational goddess. Here, the teacup has become a substitute for a tantric skull cup used to catch the gushing fluid. The menacing, violently graphic, but simultaneously playful nature of the figure is made all the more unsettling by the sculpture's uncanny realism and immediacy. Bhatti describes the goddesses she's attracted to, including popular images of Kali, as ones that are strangely masculine. This interest in gender fluidity extends to her own sculptures. Here, Chinnamasta has breasts, but a phallic shape emerges from her groin, binding her to the log. In some images of Chinnamasta, she's shown squatting over the passive body of the god Shiva while being penetrated by his erect phallus, which is equally suggested here. The log as inert as the corpse, like Shiva, evoking his presence. The deliberate gender ambiguity of Bhatti's figure recalls the circa 3rd century description of the woman on top sexual position in the Kama Sutra, in which it's not called the reverse posture, but Purusha Yitva, to play the man's role. As part of the exhibition's public programme, we hosted a virtual panel discussion on the impact of Tantra on modern and contemporary art, with artists whose work featured in the show, including Bhatti and Shuthapa. Because of the impact of COVID and the lockdowns, the events programme was adapted and delivered online across YouTube and social media. The upshot of this was that we actually reached a far wider global audience. Over 100,000 people engaged with the events, and viewers tuned in from over 50 countries. Events included a performance by the acclaimed musician Parvati Baul, streamed live from India, as well as the creation of a sand mandala dedicated to the goddess Vajrayogini, streamed live from Bhutan. There were also fantastic talks with scholars, including Vidya Dahejia, Madhu Khanna, Jim Mallinson, Jessica Fraser, and Nida Chanagsang. One particular highlight included a collaborative film with the Centre of Yoga Studies, focusing on a British Library manuscript illustrating tantric yoga postures, which we brought to life with the help of Jim, Ruth Westerby, and Zena Kalisperides. These are a few stills from the film. As well as being able to tune in live to these events, people could also catch up with them afterwards on YouTube, and they're still up on the BM Events channel for people to enjoy, so that also means that they have a longer lifespan. This has the major benefit of granting not only greater accessibility for the public, but also providing the show with an afterlife and legacy which it otherwise wouldn't have had. So I've now finally come to the end of my talk. So just a few words to conclude. The exhibition aimed to offer new insights into a philosophy that has shaped lives and captured imaginations for more than a millennium. From its beginnings to the present day, Tantra has challenged not only gender norms, but also religious, cultural, and political establishments. The show charted Tantra's enduring potential for opening up new ways of seeing and changing the world. It's hoped that the case studies in the exhibition will have enabled the visitor to recognise certain symbols and iconographic patterns as central to the tantric imaginary, allowing them to read the philosophy through its imagery. Above all, we hope visitors will have been stimulated and challenged to question their own ideas about the nature of the divine. Thank you.
It was super evocative. I was just saying how I wondered, I wasn't surprised by the evaluation reports about the Yogini installation. And I wanted to ask, I suppose the answer is probably sadly no, but whether the exhibition is going to be recreated anywhere else, whether it will go anywhere, or is it?
Well, that was something that we had started to explore, but unfortunately, I don't think it will travel. We were looking into it, and it might still be a possibility in the future, but yeah, it's unfortunately there are no plans on the horizon for it to tour. Possibly in the future.
That's too bad. Does that mean is the installation been sort of mothballed? Could it be revived at some point? Because it was great, and it was a hell of a thing.
Yeah, it's very easy to. I mean, it would be very easy to recreate because it was done quite simply. You know, just using yeah, I mean, as I said, like a combination of graphics and projection and sort of textile. So in fact, it's something that's very, you know, we have all the sorts of media for it. So and it was just, yeah, it was fantastic to have you involved in that.
It was a lot of fun. Yeah, no, it was great. So, yeah, I was just saying how it was kind of, you know, it doesn't come across so well in the film. How quite a idea it was with the Yogini flying around and the sound coming from it. But I was wondering also whether, I mean, I know it's a thing in obviously curating religious images, whether there was any, you have any problem there with the fact that you were showing essentially ritual images, although to my understanding nowadays, I'm not, maybe you're better aware of this because I think you've done fieldwork in Hirapur, places like that. Are these yoginis, is anyone still worshipping them, you think, in the traditional fashion? And associated with that, did you get any pushback with people sort of saying, oh, you shouldn't be doing this, or you've done this wrong, or you know?
Yeah, no, we actually no, we didn't receive any pushback. Actually, there wasn't any criticism that I was aware of. Like, I know that the Hirapur site often does receive devotional worship in the form of, you know, people leave flowers for some of the yoginis, so they receive some devotional offerings, but I haven't actually visited many of the yogini sites, so I'm not really aware of how active some of these places are as sites of worship today, but I know that at Hirapur in particular, the yoginis do receive offerings, daily offerings, but I think there are sort of people talk about sites like some of the yogini temples, like the Hirapur sites, as sort of potentially being a place of danger as well, I think, today, don't they? And you know, stories circulate about the dangers associated with the yoginis and the need to sort of pacify them even today, which is sort of so that's some of those ideas around the yoginis and their power still clearly persists in the imagination.
Sure. No, I haven't been to that many of them, but I know the same from Khajuraho, the Yogini temple there, and people would just make offerings. But I don't think they're doing anything like the sort of worship that we read about in the text. But yeah, I mean, maybe maybe you did, but maybe you should have made some offerings as well. I know that in the case of the book, I published a Petri video, which was from the Yogini edition, and it said that it was a verse in the text saying, "Whoever makes this teaching publicly known will be eaten alive by yoginis." That's good so far. It's been all right. But mind you, as I would say, I published it with Routledge, which isn't really making it publicly available. So, all right. I've got just one other question before we go. We haven't got a cut. Have you got time for a few more minutes for questions? You okay?
Yes, yeah, I do. Sorry, yeah, because I mean, I went over time. I'm aware of that. So yes, please, yeah.
I was just wondering, you were saying about the kind of colonial. I haven't really studied this in much detail, but the sort of anti-tantra attitudes during the colonial period. But of course, there was John Woodruff or Arthur Avalon, who of course was making a lot of these tantric texts public with the help of pundits in Calcutta. But do you think he was anomalous? I don't know. Was there sort of pushback against him at the time? Was he going against the general trend?
Yeah, he is such a fascinating figure as this sort of, seemingly respectable high court judge and really operating under the radar. So, I mean, there wasn't much awareness of what he was doing, I think. And of course, he was of course using the name Arthur Avalon so that he could operate under the radar. But and he did take a lot of credit from these Bengali translators, which I think there's more awareness around how much he sort of didn't really necessarily credit the Bengali translators in the way that he should have done at the time. But he is he's a very interesting figure. But I suppose the thing about him is that he attempts to sanitize Tantra, doesn't he? So he sort of insists on the five sort of offerings or impure offerings being sort of purely symbolic, and some of those ideas around the role of erotic and macabre features of tantric practice, the need to read them in purely philosophical and symbolic terms. And I think he's sort of interesting because he tries to sanitize Tantra and insist that it's, all of this sort of use of impure offerings and sexual activities just needs to be read not in a literal way. And so he's problematic from that perspective.
Right. I wonder if that was reflecting the attitudes of the pundits he was working with, perhaps.
Yeah,
maybe.
perhaps, yeah.
Right. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Now we have got a couple of questions on the slide. You've got a couple of knotty ones from Lubomir. So if we could go to Lubomir, that would be great. They're quite tricky.
Yes, good evening. Thanks for your talk. I don't know, you said you had some problems with your computer, but I don't know whether you could go back to your presentation, because I wonder, remember the picture called Women Visiting Two Nath Yoginis, and I wonder on what ground do you identify the middle figure as a female? Because it looks to me as a more as a male. So is there any inscription on the picture, or how do you arrive on the identification that she's a female, the middle one?
Oh, it's a good question. I think I did. I'm not sure. No, there isn't an inscription. I think on the day. I mean, actually, maybe this is a good observation. I think I assumed, and others have assumed, that these are three women. Actually, the figure on the right was identified as a nobleman, but of course the figure has breasts, so that was an easy one. But the figure in the middle, I had assumed was a woman. But so what makes you think it's a man?
Yes, but it's difficult to say. I just wonder on what ground you whether you have some argument for it, because at first looked, I mean, for me, it's more looks as a male, but I don't know. You are art historian, so you are more knowledgeable.
I think it was partly. I mean, this quality image maybe isn't. It could. I think it's from seeing the actual painting. It seemed that the features of this, elder figure did seem more. The features seem more typically feminine from comparisons with other Mughal paintings that feature elderly women. Like, I don't know. I mean, it was just like a sort of instant assumption, but now you're making me want to look at the painting again.
Yeah, okay.
I guess the complete absence of a beard is it's striking. I mean, to have long gutter like that, and it'd be very unusual to shave. It's impossible, but that to me, I think, is quite a strong indicator. But I agree, it's hard with a lot of these images.
On the other hand, I mean, yoginis usually have long hairs. That's quite typical for yoginis. So that's I mean, the figure on the left, it's I would say, prototypical yogini. That's right. And yeah, it's difficult. Okay, thanks for your answer. And if I may, I have also a second question. It's not so directly related to your talk. It's about the Maithuna sculptures. Do you think that these Maithuna sculptures might be somehow related to tantric cults, or are they independent because they are so widespread? You have Maithuna sculptures everywhere in Hindu and Buddhist art from various periods. So what's your opinion on the relation between Maithuna sculptures and tantric cults?
Yeah, I don't know if I have time to really quickly share an image from. Yeah, I'm just going to share. Try and share this with you. It's this sculpture here.
So you need to stop share to start share, if you remember.
Oh.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Oh God. Okay.
And then start and share again. Don't worry, it's worth it.
Okay. Yeah. So this sculpture was featured in the exhibition, and I suppose you have. I mean, and we compared it actually with this sculpture. Which shows, yeah, I mean, you do have many representations, don't you, of erotic sculptures, classically as a Khajuraho, which people are really familiar with, and sometimes the figures are interpreted as tantric, but of course, what makes the figures tantric, and there isn't really, often these figures serve as a kind of protective function and as symbols of fertility. Oh my goodness, sorry, I'm just going to quickly hang. But yes, so but the sorry, I don't know how to turn this off. I'm just going to hang on. But the thing that makes, for example, a sculpture like this one tantric is that it represents a transgressive sexual act. So you can see the male figure and the female figure on the left of this temple frieze. He's performing oral sex on the woman. It's sort of in this quite acrobatic position. But this would have been considered, a transgressive act, and therefore could be interpreted as representing a particular tantric ritual, like yoni puja, or veneration of the yoni, and ritual around ingesting the sexual fluids of a woman. And so I think definitely there are, and this is an example, obviously, of a Maithuna sculpture. So this is the argument amongst many scholars anyway, is that that's how you can identify medieval erotic sculptures, mainly from around the 10th century onwards, that represent transgressive acts as much, as relating to tantric iconography and tantric rituals. And then other sculptures, such as this one, are can't be described as tantric because it's, you know, there isn't anything transgressive about it. This is just a product of Orthodox Hindu iconography at the time that was very popular across the exterior of Hindu temples.
Great, thanks.
I'm unmuting myself, so I muted myself. Thanks, Ina. We've got a couple of anonymous questions. Well, one very simple one is because you cut when you were, the sound went a bit bad at the end, was when you were saying where the recordings were, and so someone's asking how we can access them.
Which recordings are those?
The films that the films that were associated with the exhibition.
Oh,
on the British Museum site, or are they on YouTube? I can't remember.
yeah, they're on YouTube on the British Museum events channel. I hope you were able to hear me when I talked about the Centre of Yoga Studies film that was made.
Sort of, a little bit of it cut out, but yeah, we saw the images. So that was good to remember that. Well, maybe we can provide some links.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I could record that bit with Theo again, and so that it can be put on the end of the YouTube video.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, tag that on. Excellent, with the links. And then one last question, because we're getting near time, and it's an anonymous one, and I imagine you could give a very long answer, but it's thank you. It was a wonderful and evocative exhibition. Can you describe a little of the process of curation and how it came together?
Oh, that's a great question. So it was sort of initially proposed as I initially proposed it as a book because I was really struck by the British Museum's extensive collection of tantric material, and then the head of exhibitions thought it would make quite a compelling show. I wasn't given a huge amount of time to develop it as a show. I think in the end it was only about 2 years from start to finish, and I worked closely with a designer and an interpretation officer, and first of all we had to finalise how many objects we could physically include in the space, and so I think there were around 120 objects, and mainly from the British Museum's own collection. But it was really hard to create that sort of shortlist. Actually, that was a real challenge, and then identify the international loans that we wanted to include, which I think we had about 30 international loans in the end. And then once we had that object list, it was a matter of sort of working with the interpretation officer to map out how many sorts of chapters the show should have. And I wanted the book to reflect the same kind of structure as well. So the show had 5 main sections, which are very, very roughly chronological, sort of beginning in the medieval period and ending today. And it was quite interesting to work with the designer to map out how to really differentiate those 5 sections of the show using colour. We even kind of played with the idea of, tantra, the root of tan from tantra meaning to weave or to compose, and so with the designer we worked with the graphics to sort of try and suggest weaving, which I'm sure no visitors, I'm sure that wasn't actually apparent to any visitors, but we quite liked playing with that idea, and it looked very beautiful. But the curation was challenging as well, because as I mentioned, of the word count, and it's such a complex subject that we wanted to make as accessible as possible. So working with the interpretation officer to really try and control it, really try and have that, bring out the inner editor to try not to get carried away with wanting to write too much, because at the end of the day, the visitor enters the space and can only really manage maybe an hour or just over an hour, because they're standing most of the time, and they want to have deep engagement with each object that they come into contact with, and in a way a label presents a little bit of an obstacle for deep engagement. So we wanted to keep it as simple as possible, and but that was challenging, because you also want to really draw out the nuances and complexities of Tantra, and not reduce or in any way oversimplify Tantra. So that, for me, there was a real tension there, but I enjoyed the challenge.
Well, I think you rose to it admirably. No, you definitely pulled it off. It was great. It was a wonderful show. Yeah, it's a shame no one can get to visit anymore. But yes, the second best is the catalogue. The book is wonderful, everyone. I highly recommend that. It's a beautiful creation as well. But we're going to finish there. We've gone after beyond 8:15, our usual limit. Thank you so much, Emma. That was great.
Thank you.
Really nice to revisit it. So thanks very much. I hope we can collaborate again on something in the future.